It's the end of Shaketember for another year. Hello, my name's Gavin. This is Genre Books, and we're going to be talking about a playwright. He grew into writing a kind of tragicomedy style, which hadn't really been employed before. He collaborated with other playwrights. He's a drinking buddy of Ben Jonson. He wrote for a group of actors at Blackfriars and entered into an exclusive arrangement to write plays for the King's Men. All of these things I could say about William Shakespeare, but I'm talking about John Fletcher. And I want to begin briefly by talking about John Fletcher because he probably wrote some of this play, Henry VIII. Of the three plays we think he wrote with Shakespeare, only one of them, which is Henry VIII, is in your traditional collected works of Shakespeare. The others are The Two Noble Kinsmen, which doesn't appear here, and a third is Cardenio, which unfortunately doesn't appear anywhere. It's a lost play. But I mention Fletcher because I think it is the most likely reason the language in this play is slightly different. There are other reasons as well, of course. Shakespeare is by this point a more experienced writer. When you look at the history plays in the order they were written, Henry VIII comes after Henry V, and that was well over a decade's gap. The stage directions in this play are more numerous and prescriptive than I think any other Shakespeare play I've read, but the actual lines themselves sound or read slightly different. It's difficult to tell where this influence comes from, whether this is Shakespeare himself or whether this is because he's writing this alongside someone else. It's all the more difficult to tell because this is Shakespeare's last completed play, and it's a fairly quiet coda to his works. It's certainly a more restrained piece than the other histories, mostly because of the subject that it's dealing with. This is more court intrigue than it is dynastic wrangling and battles between royal houses. There's certainly still some dynastic issues here. Henry VIII does have dynastic considerations at the top of his list when it comes to his reasons for wanting to divorce his wife, Catherine, to wed Anne Boleyn in this play and hopefully produce a male heir. Henry has by this point been married to Catherine for 2 decades, but he's just about to begin on his journey of changing his wife a lot. The primary source here for Shakespeare, as with his other histories, are the chronicles from Raphael Holinshed. And you can take all of these with a pinch of salt, and you can add an extra bushel of salt added by Shakespeare's consistent propagandizing for the Tudors. I think any criticism you have of Henry VIII is what you read into this play. He's very careful to not show it on the page, and he's very careful that none of the other characters, none of the other people in the play criticize him. This includes the wife he is divorcing. This includes people he has just had condemned to death. Everybody loves Henry. Certainly they're too frightened to say otherwise, and perhaps Shakespeare is as well. By this point, Elizabeth I has died, and we have James I on the throne. But Shakespeare is still being very nice about the Tudors, even though we are now in a Stuart dynasty. But for a contemporary reader, and certainly knowing what comes next with Henry VIII, it is much easier to pick fault with him. He is too easily swayed by Wolsey. He has the wool pulled over his eyes once too often. Despite his protestations, he allows himself to be very easily convinced that his marriage to Catherine is null and void. But he only sees this sin in his marriage after Anne Boleyn has caught his eye. The themes here are trust and a cautionary tale about being too trusting. It's about betrayal and ambition. Everyone has an agenda. So it's still, for a history play with little action, has a lot going on. And very few people seem to be immune from the themes of the play. Henry is certainly ambitious to want to keep his lineage going. He has personal ambition in wanting to get a new wife. Wolsey has ambition as just a general power grab, but he does this at the expense of everyone else in the court, whether this is indicating that someone is best suited to a post at the other end of the country or in Ireland and keeping them out of the picture, or implicating them in treasonous plots against the king and getting them sent to the Tower. But he overextends himself, and through a slip-up, Henry realises the extent of his ambition. And with the power of the monarch, destroys him without even sending him to the Tower or having him killed. He simply basically disinherits him. He is in no position of power. All of the worldly goods Wolsey has accumulated are taken from him. Wolsey is replaced by Cranmer, who is possibly the only paragon of virtue in this play. You can possibly make an argument for Catherine as well. This is not some great insight. There are ways of telling. Cranmer, I think, is one of the few characters not to give a cheeky aside to the audience in the way that anyone who is dissembling on the stage wants to do. He certainly convinces Henry, although Henry does seem to be easily convinced by pretty much anyone in this play. But Henry shows that he can be loyal to other people in his treatment of Cranmer. Rivals and enemies of Cranmer try to get him sent to the Tower. Henry steps in. He is actually invoked by Cranmer and saves his skin. There is not too much talk about the crown in this play, but certainly the sovereign's ring helps here. This ring Henry gives to Cranmer, and basically Cranmer uses it like the bat signal when he is in trouble, when he is about to go to the Tower. He says, I have this token from the sovereign, call him here, let's see what he has to say. The only other mention of crowns really in the play is with Catherine, who is in a position where the crown is taken from her when the divorce is granted, and falling sick after this judgment is made, and on her deathbed we see spirits arrive and tease her with not so much a crown as a garland, and you can see that this crown, which is going to be presented to her in the hereafter, is on offer to her. But her temporal crown, her actual royal crown, is now taken by Anne Boleyn, who, whilst at the beginning of this play, is very clear and set that she wants nothing to do with the court intrigue. She doesn't really want to be she doesn't want to be a duchess, let alone the queen. But when the king makes her, I think, Countess of Pembrokeshire with a title and an annual amount of money, I think the ambition sort of slowly creeps in there. And she is being egged along by one of her old servants, who certainly seems to be an avaricious woman. Anne says to her, "By my troth and maidenhead, I would not be a queen." The old lady says, "Beshrew me, I would, and venture maidenhead for it, and so would you, for all the spice of your hypocrisy." And again Anne says, "How you do talk, I swear again I would not be queen for all the world." To which she replies, "I myself would, for Carnarvonshire." Which I should imagine is something that, if this play ever got produced these days, would get a knowing laugh from the knowledgeable people in the audience. But the main woman character in this, who gets no lines, is the baby Elizabeth I, born to Henry and Anne at the end of the play. Cranmer, at the baptism, prophesies about Elizabeth, what Elizabeth is going to become. Shakespeare, at this point, could write what he liked about Elizabeth. She's dead and gone, but he is still very complimentary. But this is a history play with a happy ending. Now, I suppose you could say Richard III has the same. But this is achieved after far less strife than the previous history plays. This is more mannered entirely. And one of the themes here is the experience of forgiveness. Buckingham, who has been condemned to death through the machinations of Wolsey, forgives everyone their wrongs, forgives the king his wrongs in condemning him. Wolsey, in turn, once he has been rumbled, once his schemes have been discovered and he has been disinherited, basically feels like he has had a weight lifted from him, and slightly atones for his behaviour, but basically cleanses his own conscience and feels the lighter for forgiving anyone who has put him in this position. Although I think he is quite forgiving of himself as well. Catherine never blames Henry, and even goes so far on hearing of Wolsey's death as to forgive him to an extent. Gardiner and Cranmer, who are at each other's throats, or Gardiner's trying to get Cranmer sent to the Tower, when entreated to by Henry, forgive each other. I don't know how true that is. Again, there are no asides given to the audience, so I think we probably have to take it at face value. But they both do well out of this. Cranmer retains his position, as does Gardiner. There seems to be peace, which obviously is a good way to end the history plays. But it does make for an odd ending to reading these histories over this last month, where there has been so much strife, battle, enmity, loss, death. This is certainly a palate cleanser of a play. So having read all the histories in a month, I'm going to take some time to process my thoughts about it. But initially, my first thought is that they are not performed enough. I went back and looked at the last 20 years worth of RSC productions. It's not like the histories aren't performed, but they are not performed as much as comedies and tragedies. When I come to read those plays, as I will in future Shaketembers, I'm going to notice that certain of the comedies are not performed very often. I don't think you often see The Taming of the Shrew these days. Some of the problem plays are not performed often. Measure for Measure, Winter's Tale, Troilus and Cressida, not seen performed often, whereas A Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, King Lear, Macbeth are perennial favourites, seemingly always a production going on somewhere. For the histories, Henry V, Richard III, they're the ones that you see most often. There are logistical problems with Henry VI because you can't really do one part of Henry VI. You will have to do all three parts, so you're putting on 3 plays. The same with Henry IV to an extent. You've got both parts of that play. King John is too divorced from the lineage of the rest of the plays. Henry VIII seems too much of a different beast to link to the other plays. But I think the thing that perhaps the people that put these plays on are missing is that there is so much more going on here than just the history. In fact, the history is quite often, I'm not going to say wrong, but distorted. Shakespeare is a Tudor propagandist. He's taking already very personally biased information written down by Hollingshead and is producing it for a specific audience, currying royal favour if he possibly can. And he certainly over-eggs certain things. Henry IV doesn't come off particularly well. Richard III certainly doesn't. Henry V obviously comes across very well in his own play, but in the Henry IV Part 1 and 2, we are sort of questioning him. He oscillates between showing flashes of the monarch he will become and being this sort of tearaway led astray by Falstaff, which is not something that is really based in reality. He was not the tearaway he is depicted as being. But Henry V was not so uproarious, Richard III wasn't quite so evil, and Henry VII is nowhere near as good and virtuous as they are all shown to be. So don't decide not to stage the history plays because of people don't want to be bothered by history. They won't be bothered by history. If you want to read the history of the times, read a history book. Don't rely on these plays. These plays are dramatic enough. They are personal enough. They are well written enough to warrant production in and of themselves, even if you substituted every character's name for someone completely fictional. Although purporting to be about the history of time from 2 or more centuries previous, they offer a social commentary of their own time. And they possibly do it in a more pointed way because they are specifically about politics. We can also see attitudes towards the divinity of the king, which is something perhaps a little more worrying to write about once you have people like Elizabeth and James I on the throne. talking about the natural order of things, worrying about the dynasty, the inheritance, especially all the plays written under Elizabeth when we don't really know who's going to be the next monarch, and the propaganda which Shakespeare indulges in the writing of these plays is specifically to maintain that natural order of things. He's a monarchist. The citizens, the 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 audience of the play really come off well in the history plays. But what the history plays do show is more of a cross section of the classes of the time than some of the other plays. If you take Shakespeare's comedies, the majority of them show characters who are in a bubble, they are in the same social strata. With the history plays, you have everyone from the king anointed by God himself down to the peasantry, whether that is tavern owners, whether that is soldiers. And because of the stories the histories are telling, sometimes these sections of class mix and clash and rub up against each other in a way they don't in other Shakespeare plays. But I think you should put these on because at the end of the day they are just family dramas, and that is always going to be popular. I joked last week, yes, calling the Yorks and the Lancasters the Starks and the Lannisters. That's not so much of a joke. It's obviously based. Game of Thrones is obviously based on the Wars of the Roses. You can't tell me that the Lannisters of Casterly Rock aren't the Lancasters. But that's how you should sell the histories. That's how you should make them more appealing to a modern audience. Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, is Stannis Baratheon. He is not well liked, but he has duty and he is upright and he is just, he's a little dull perhaps. But Jon Snow is probably Henry V. Tyrion is Falstaff. If anyone in Shakespeare is going to be wearing a t-shirt that says I drink and I know things, it's going to be Falstaff. I don't know why the history plays aren't performed more. I think you have at this moment a way to be able to sell them. But there you go. I've said my piece. Shaketember's over. I've now read all the histories. I'm going to think about what I want to read for next Shaketember. That could be a problem. Until then.